July 5, 1943. The Kursk salient, Soviet Union. Dawn breaks across the endless steppe, painting the wheat fields in shades of amber and blood red. The ground trembles. Not from artillery, though that will come soon enough, but from the approach of what German commanders believe will be their salvation. 51 tons of steel, sloped armor, and lethal firepower roll forward through the morning mist. The Panzerkampfwagen 5, better known to history as the Panther tank. Inside these metal beasts, crews sweat in the stifling heat, their faces tight with anticipation and something else. Something none of them want to name. They have been told these machines are invincible, the answer to every problem the Wehrmacht has faced on the Eastern Front. They have been told the Panther will restore German superiority. Within 72 hours, most of these magnificent machines will be abandoned hulks scattered across the battlefield, defeated not by Soviet shells but by their own mechanical hearts, tearing themselves apart from within. The story of the Panther tank is not simply a tale of one weapon system. It is a parable about the nature of war itself, about the fatal seduction of perfection, and about how the pursuit of technical superiority can become a kind of madness that blinds rational men to fundamental truths. It is a story that begins not at Kursk but 2 years earlier, in the summer of 1941, when German panzer divisions crashed across the Soviet border in Operation Barbarossa, convinced of swift victory, only to encounter something their intelligence had dismissed as impossible: the T-34. The Soviet T-34 medium tank revolutionized armored warfare in ways that sent shockwaves through the German high command. German tankers who had swept across France and the Low Countries with casual dominance suddenly found themselves facing a machine that seemed to violate every assumption they held about Soviet industrial capability. The T-34 possessed steeply sloped armor that caused German anti-tank shells to ricochet harmlessly into the air. Its wide tracks distributed weight across soft ground, allowing it to traverse terrain that would bog down German panzers. Its diesel engine was reliable, powerful, and far less prone to catching fire than German gasoline engines. Most troubling of all, its 76mm gun could penetrate any German tank then in service, while German guns struggled to harm the T-34 in return. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German panzer tactics, witnessed the T-34 in action and immediately recognized the crisis it represented. He wrote in his memoirs that the appearance of the T-34 marked a decisive moment when German technological superiority, so carefully cultivated, so deeply believed in, suddenly evaporated like morning fog. The shock was not merely tactical, but psychological. The German military machine had built its reputation on technological dominance. The panzers that had crushed Poland in weeks and brought France to its knees in 40 days were supposed to be invincible. The T-34 exposed this as mythology. For the first time since the war began, German soldiers faced an opponent whose equipment was not just adequate but genuinely superior. The German response was predictable. If the enemy possessed a superior tank, Germany would build an even better one. Not merely equal, but dominant. Not adequate, but perfect. This decision, this commitment to out-engineering the problem rather than out-producing it, would prove to be one of the most consequential mistakes of the entire war. It reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of what modern industrial warfare demanded. The Germans believed they were fighting a contest of quality. In reality, they had entered a war of quantity, and they refused to accept the implications until it was far too late. The Panther development program began in the winter of 1941 with specifications that read like a wish list, written by men who had never considered the practical realities of mass production or field maintenance. The new tank would incorporate the T-34's sloped armor design, taking the concept even further. Its frontal armor would measure 80 millimeters thick at 55 degrees from vertical, creating effective protection equivalent to 140 millimeters of vertical plate. No Allied tank gun then in service could hope to penetrate it from the front at combat ranges. The Panther would mount a long-barreled 75mm gun, the KWK-42, with a muzzle velocity so high that it could punch through 4 inches of armor at 2,000 yards. This weapon represented the cutting edge of anti-tank technology, capable of destroying any Allied tank at ranges where return fire would be ineffective. The design team, led by engineers at MAN, the Maschinenfabrik Augsburg-Nürnberg, worked at a frantic pace. Hitler himself took a personal interest in the project, demanding regular updates and insisting on design features that added complexity and weight. The Führer's interference in technical matters became legendary among German engineers, who learned to dread his visits and his insistence on modifications that looked impressive but compromised functionality. Hitler wanted thicker armor. He wanted more powerful guns. He wanted features that would make the Panther not just superior, but overwhelming. Each demand added weight. Each addition created new engineering challenges. The Panther grew and grew. The original weight target was 35 tons, comparable to the T-34. This was already ambitious given the armor and armament specifications, but it represented at least a theoretically achievable goal. By the time the first prototype rolled out in September 1942, the Panther tipped the scales at 43 tons. The production version would eventually reach 51 tons, nearly double the weight of the tank it was meant to counter. This weight gain created a cascade of engineering problems that would never be adequately solved. Every component designed for a 35-ton vehicle was now being asked to perform in a machine that weighed nearly 50% more. The engine struggled, the transmission groaned, the suspension sagged, and the final drive, that critical component connecting engine power to track movement, was pushed far beyond its design limits from day one. The Panther's suspension system used a sophisticated double torsion bar arrangement with interleaved road wheels. 8 road wheels per side overlapped in a pattern that distributed weight evenly and provided an exceptionally smooth ride. On test tracks and parade grounds, this system was impressive. German newsreels showed Panthers gliding across rough terrain with barely a tremor, the crew inside sipping coffee to demonstrate the stability. This was excellent propaganda. It was also deeply misleading about the system's practical utility. The overlapping wheels collected mud, snow, and debris, which froze solid in Russian winter conditions, immobilizing the tank completely. Replacing an inner road wheel, which might fail due to the extraordinary stresses placed on it, required removing multiple outer wheels first, a process that could take an entire day even with experienced mechanics and proper tools. In combat conditions, with limited tools and exhausted crews, it was nearly impossible. The transmission, developed by Maybach, was a marvel of precision engineering with 7 forward gears and 1 reverse. It offered fine control over speed and power delivery, allowing skilled drivers to extract maximum performance from the Maybach HL230 engine. It was also temperamental, prone to oil leaks, and required constant adjustment by skilled mechanics who understood its intricacies. The transmission represented the apex of German automotive engineering, which was precisely the problem. It was designed for autobahns and peacetime conditions, not for the mud of Russia or the dust of North Africa. Each gear was a precisely machined work of art. Each synchromesh mechanism required exact tolerances. When components wore, which they did rapidly under combat stress, the entire transmission could become unreliable. Replacement required removing the turret, a major operation that could take days and required specialized equipment rarely available in forward areas. But the Achilles heel, the fatal flaw that would doom the Panther to a reputation for unreliability that persists to this day, was the final drive. The final drive is the last element in the drivetrain, the gearbox that connects the transmission to the drive sprocket that actually turns the tracks. In any tracked vehicle, this component experiences enormous stress. It must transmit all the engine's power, reduced through the transmission, into the rotational force that moves the vehicle. In the Panther, this component had to transmit enormous torque from the Maybach HL230 engine, a 23-liter V12 producing 700 horsepower, to tracks that had to move 51 tons of steel across all terrain, in all conditions, often at high speed. The final drive design, designated AK-7-200, was inadequate from the beginning. German engineers knew it. Test results made it clear. During trials at the Kummersdorf proving grounds, final drives failed repeatedly. Engineers recommended a complete redesign, strengthening the gears and increasing the size of the housing. But there was no time. Hitler had personally declared that the Panther would be ready for the summer offensive of 1943. Kursk awaited. The great encirclement that would destroy Soviet forces and restore German momentum on the Eastern Front could not wait for engineers to perfect their designs. The decision was made to proceed with production using the inadequate final drive, with the understanding that improvements would be incorporated into later production batches. This decision, made in the urgency of war, condemned thousands of Panther crews to fight in machines that were fundamentally unreliable. The final drive consisted of a series of precision gears running in an oil bath, sealed inside a housing mounted at the front of the hull. The gears were cut from hardened steel, heat-treated to maximize strength. At least that was the theory. Under ideal conditions with perfect lubrication, minimal stress, and regular maintenance, the design might have been marginally acceptable. But war offers no ideal conditions. The sheer weight of the Panther, combined with the high torque of its powerful engine, placed stresses on the final drive gears that exceeded their design limits every time the driver shifted gears or asked for maximum acceleration. The teeth of the gears, those precisely machined surfaces that had to mesh perfectly to transmit power, began to wear immediately. The materials themselves were suspect. By 1943, Germany faced critical shortages of molybdenum, nickel, and other alloying elements essential for producing high-quality steel. The naval blockade and the loss of access to overseas sources meant that German industry had to make do with what was available within Fortress Europe. Ersatz substitutes were used, inferior materials pressed into service because nothing else was available. Steel that should have contained 3% nickel made do with 1%. Alloys that required molybdenum for hardness used manganese instead, which provided some of the desired properties, but not all. The result was predictable. The final drive gears, made from substandard steel, could not withstand the forces they experienced in normal operation. Under combat conditions, often before even reaching combat, the final drives began to fail. The failure mode was consistent and catastrophic. The gear teeth would begin to wear unevenly, creating vibration and noise that crews learned to recognize with dread. As wear progressed, the gears would begin to skip under load, producing a distinctive grinding sound. Eventually, teeth would shear off completely. Once this happened, the final drive was finished. The tank could not move. It became a 51-ton paperweight, a pillbox at best, a target at worst. The only solution was replacement of the entire final drive assembly, which required specialized tools, a crane or hoist to lift the component into place, and several hours of work by skilled mechanics. These resources were rarely available in combat zones. Panthers with failed final drives were usually destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The operational implications were catastrophic. In July 1943, as the Panthers rolled into battle at Kursk in what would be the largest tank engagement in history, the mechanical failure rate was apocalyptic. Of the 200 Panthers committed to the northern pincer of the offensive under Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, 162 were disabled by mechanical problems within the first 48 hours. Not destroyed by enemy fire, not knocked out by Soviet anti-tank guns, or the new Su-152 self-propelled guns the Soviets had rushed into service. Simply broken down by the side of the road, transmission fluid leaking into the dirt, final drives ground to immobility, crews sitting helplessly as Soviet forces maneuvered around them. The southern pincer under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein fared little better. Panther battalions that were supposed to form the armored spearhead of the offensive instead left trails of disabled vehicles marking their axis of advance. Manstein, one of Germany's most capable field commanders, watched in disbelief as his carefully planned offensive dissolved not under enemy shells, but under the weight of its own complexity. He had been promised that the Panther would restore German armored superiority, that it would allow his forces to smash through Soviet defenses and achieve the kind of mobile warfare that had brought Germany such success in the war's early years. Instead, he found his armored formations immobilized by their own equipment. His after-action reports, carefully worded to avoid directly criticizing Hitler's pet project, nevertheless made clear that the Panther had been a catastrophic disappointment. He recommended that future production focus on proven designs like the Panzer IV or the Stu G3 assault gun. His recommendations were ignored. The official histories would later try to obscure this embarrassment, attributing the failures to insufficient crew training or the difficulties of deploying a new tank type directly into a major offensive without adequate shakedown time. There was some truth to these explanations. Panther crews had limited training on the new type, and mechanical systems always experienced teething problems. But the truth, recorded in maintenance logs and after-action reports filed by battalion and regimental commanders, painted a different picture. The Panther was not ready for combat. More fundamentally, the Panther would never be truly ready for combat in the way its designers had envisioned, because its design philosophy was flawed at the conceptual level. German engineers had created a tank that excelled on paper, in carefully controlled test conditions, but collapsed under the chaos and stress of actual warfare. Throughout the remainder of the war, operational availability rates for Panther units remained abysmal. On any given day, between 30 and 50% of Panthers were deadlined for maintenance, awaiting spare parts, or in the process of having major components replaced. Some divisions reported readiness rates as low as 20%. The 5th SS Panzer Division, equipped with Panthers in Normandy, reported that of its 79 Panthers, only 37 were operational on June 6, 1944, the day of the Allied invasion. By June 10th, that number had fallen to 17, and only 5 of those failures were due to combat damage. The rest had simply broken down. A tank that cannot move is not a tank. It is a bunker, and an immobile bunker is a target. German doctrine, developed over years of successful campaigns, called for fluid, mobile warfare, for panzer formations to maneuver and strike weak points in enemy lines, to exploit breakthroughs and turn enemy flanks. The Panther made such operations nearly impossible. Advancing Panthers left trails of broken-down hulks in their wake, each one requiring recovery vehicles like the Berge Panther, a specialized recovery version of the Panther itself. These recovery vehicles were never available in sufficient numbers. Each disabled Panther required hours or days of work, spare parts that did not exist in adequate quantities, and mechanics skilled enough to perform complex repairs under fire or in makeshift field workshops. Panther battalions became tethered to their maintenance trains in ways that more reliable tanks were not. They could not range far from their support elements. They could not exploit sudden opportunities because they lacked confidence their machines would carry them through. Commanders had to factor mechanical reliability into every operational plan, always assuming that a significant percentage of their strength would be unavailable when needed. Contrast this with the American approach embodied in the M4 Sherman medium tank. The Sherman was not a technical marvel. Its armor was adequate at best, vulnerable to German anti-tank guns at most combat ranges. The frontal armor measured only 63 millimeters at a relatively gentle slope, compared to the Panther's 80 millimeters at a much more favorable angle. Its 75 millimeter gun, while effective against most targets, could not reliably penetrate a Panther's frontal armor except at point-blank range. German tankers derisively called the Sherman a Tommy Cooker, or Ronson, after the cigarette lighter that advertised itself as lighting the first time, every time, a dark joke about how readily Shermans caught fire when penetrated. American crews called their own tanks Zippos for the same reason. The Sherman had a high silhouette that made it easy to spot. Its riveted construction meant that even non-penetrating hits could cause rivets to shear off inside the crew compartment, turning into lethal projectiles. By any direct comparison of armor and firepower, the Sherman was outclassed by the Panther. But the Sherman had one overwhelming advantage that made all its deficiencies irrelevant in the final accounting. It worked. The Sherman's mechanical reliability was exceptional, especially by the standards of armored vehicles of its era. Its Continental R975 radial engine, borrowed from aircraft design, or the later variants that used other power plants, including the Ford GAAV8, were simple, robust, and easy to maintain. These engines were not cutting-edge technology. They were proven, reliable designs that had accumulated thousands of hours of operational experience in other applications. Crews could perform most field repairs with basic tools and minimal training. The transmission was straightforward, using a manual gearbox that any mechanic familiar with truck transmissions could understand and repair. There were no precision synchromesh mechanisms requiring exact tolerances. Just simple, robust gears designed with generous margins. The suspension, using a vertical Volati spring system, was nearly indestructible. The bogies could be replaced individually without affecting the rest of the suspension. The tracks, while they required regular maintenance, rarely threw themselves and could be repaired in the field with minimal equipment. Parts were standardized across all Sherman variants. A replacement bogie from one Sherman would fit any other Sherman. An engine from a scrap tank could be swapped into a damaged one in a matter of hours. Most critically, the Sherman's operational availability rates routinely exceeded 90%. When American armored divisions advanced, nearly every tank moved with them. Commanders could plan operations knowing that the vast majority of their assigned strength would actually be available when the attack commenced. An entire Sherman could be field stripped and rebuilt faster than a Panther crew could replace a single inner road wheel. This was not hyperbole but documented fact. American maintenance doctrine emphasized returning tanks to service as quickly as possible, even if the repair was not perfect. A Sherman with a jury-rigged repair that restored mobility was infinitely more valuable than a Panther awaiting the perfect spare part that would never arrive. American crews became expert at improvisation, at making do, at keeping their machines running through ingenuity and determination. They welded on extra armor plates scrounged from knocked-out vehicles. They modified stowage arrangements to suit their needs. They adapted their tactics to their equipment's capabilities rather than demanding equipment that matched theoretical ideals. American industrial production amplified this reliability advantage into an overwhelming material superiority that Germany could never hope to match. The United States produced approximately 50,000 Sherman tanks during the war, along with countless other armored vehicles based on the same chassis. Germany manufactured 6,000 Panthers over the same period. These numbers tell a story more eloquent than any after-action report. Even if the Panther had been mechanically perfect, which it emphatically was not, the sheer numerical disparity would have been decisive. But combined with the Panther's chronic unreliability, the situation became hopeless. For every Panther that reached the battlefield in working condition, 8 Shermans rolled forward. Engines purring, tracks tight, crews confident their machines would not betray them at the critical moment. The mathematics of attrition warfare are brutal and unforgiving. If one Panther could destroy 3 Shermans before being knocked out, which was an optimistic assumption, the Americans could afford the exchange. They would build 3 more Shermans faster than Germany could build 1 more Panther. If the Panther destroyed 5 Shermans, the calculus remained unfavorable for Germany. Only if each Panther could reliably destroy 8 or more Shermans did the numbers begin to work in Germany's favor. And the operational reality was that most Panthers never destroyed any enemy tanks at all. They broke down. They ran out of fuel. They were abandoned when their units retreated. The handful of Panthers that did reach combat and perform as designed could not compensate for the majority that never fulfilled their intended role. The resource allocation question became increasingly urgent as Germany's strategic situation deteriorated through 1944 and into 1945. A single Panther required approximately 300,000 man-hours to manufacture, compared to 10,000 for a Sherman. This disparity reflected the complexity of the Panther's design, the precision required in manufacturing its components, and the labor-intensive assembly process. Every hour spent building Panthers was an hour not spent building other weapons. The Panther consumed specialized materials that were desperately scarce: high-grade steel for armor, precision bearings for the transmission and final drives, optical glass for rangefinders and sights, rubber for road wheels and track pads. Every Panther built meant fewer Panzer IVs, fewer assault guns, fewer of the simpler, more reliable vehicles that might have made a difference in defensive battles where mobility mattered less than availability. The Panther demanded skilled mechanics, men who understood complex transmissions and sophisticated suspensions. Germany needed these skilled workers in factories, building more weapons. Instead, they were at the front, struggling to keep Panthers operational. Panther units required extensive spare parts inventories that had to be manufactured, transported, and stored. They needed dedicated recovery vehicles to retrieve disabled tanks. They required more fuel per kilometer traveled than simpler tanks, and Germany's fuel situation was desperate by late 1944. They consumed more lubricants, more maintenance supplies, more of everything. In an industrial war of attrition against enemies who vastly outproduced Germany in every category, This was suicide. The philosophical differences between German and American design approaches reflected deeper cultural attitudes toward warfare, technology, and the relationship between man and machine. German engineering culture, shaped by centuries of traditions of craftsmanship and technical perfectionism, viewed each tank as a precision instrument, a mechanical masterpiece that should represent the pinnacle of technological achievement. German engineers took pride in sophisticated solutions to complex problems. They valued elegance in design, where a single clever mechanism could replace multiple simpler components. They pursued performance at the edge of what was technically possible, pushing boundaries and accepting risk in exchange for superior specifications. This mindset produced remarkable innovations throughout the war. German optics were the best in the world. German rangefinders and fire control systems were more accurate than Allied equivalents. German metallurgy achieved results that Allied scientists studied with admiration after the war. But this same mindset also produced machines so complex they could only function under ideal conditions that war never provides. The German approach assumes skilled operators, regular maintenance, abundant spare parts, and operating environments that allowed machines to be used as designed. These assumptions might have been valid in peacetime. They were fantasy in war. The genius German engineer who designed an elegant solution using precisely machined components, operating at tight tolerances, created a machine that was fundamentally fragile. When components were beyond tolerance, when maintenance was deferred, when operating conditions exceeded design parameters, these elegant machines failed catastrophically. American design philosophy, by contrast, was rooted in pragmatism and mass production principles pioneered by Henry Ford and refined through decades of American industrial experience. American engineers asked not what is technically possible, but what can be manufactured in quantity, maintained in the field, and operated by average crews with limited training. They accepted compromises. They built in redundancy. They designed for the 95th percentile use case, not the ideal. The Sherman was not the best tank in any single category, but it was good enough in all of them, and it was reliable. Its armor was adequate. Its gun was sufficient. Its mobility was acceptable. Most importantly, it worked. Day after day, month after month, it worked. In war, reliable beats perfect every single time. This philosophical divide extended beyond hardware into doctrine and training. German Panzer crews received extensive training on their specific vehicles, learning the intricacies of the Panther's systems in detail. This training produced highly skilled crews who could extract maximum performance from their machines. But it also meant that when crew members were killed or wounded, replacements lacked the institutional knowledge needed to operate effectively. American crews received more generalized training that emphasized principles over specifics. An American tanker could transfer from one Sherman to another and be fully operational within hours. The controls were the same. The procedures were the same. The simplicity of American vehicles meant that training could focus on tactics and teamwork rather than technical minutiae. Allied intelligence services documented the Panther's weaknesses meticulously and disseminated this information to frontline units through technical bulletins, training films, and tactical updates. Tank commanders learned to avoid frontal engagements with Panthers whenever possible, instead maneuvering for flank shots where the Panther's thinner side armor of 45 millimeters could be penetrated even by the Sherman's basic 75 millimeter gun. They learned that Panthers were likely to be found broken down along their axis of advance, presenting easy targets for artillery or airstrikes. They learned that smoke and artillery could suppress Panther positions while friendly armor maneuvered into favorable positions. They learned that patience was often rewarded because Panthers frequently disabled themselves without any Allied intervention required. Most importantly, they learned that the Panthers' fearsome reputation was largely psychological warfare, a myth that could be dispelled through experience and proper tactics. Yes, it was dangerous in the rare circumstances when it was both operational and properly positioned, with a clear field of fire and competent crew. But those circumstances were rare. More often, Panthers were encountered in less than ideal situations, broken down by the roadside, low on fuel and unable to maneuver, crewed by inexperienced replacements after veteran crews had been killed. Operating without infantry support because German manpower shortages meant combined arms operations were increasingly impossible. In these common scenarios, the Panther was no more dangerous than any other tank, and often less so because its mechanical unreliability meant it could not reposition or withdraw when threatened. The human cost of Germany's obsession with technical perfection is harder to quantify, but no less real. Panther crews trained for months on machines that would abandon them in their hour of need. Young men, many of them barely out of adolescence, placed their faith in technology that looked invincible but was fundamentally flawed. They learned complex maintenance procedures they could not perform under combat conditions. They memorized the characteristics of systems that would fail before ever proving their worth. They climbed into their Panthers each morning, not knowing if this would be the day the final drive failed. The transmission locked up. The engine caught fire. The psychological burden of fighting in a machine you cannot trust is difficult for civilians to comprehend. A tank crew depends absolutely on their vehicle. It is mobility, protection, and firepower combined. When that vehicle is unreliable, when crews know their Panther might betray them at any moment, the stress becomes overwhelming. Recovery crews risk their lives under fire to retrieve broken-down Panthers that would break down again within days or weeks. These brave men drove their Berge Panther recovery vehicles into no man's land, attached tow cables to disabled tanks, and dragged them back to friendly lines while under constant threat from artillery, aircraft, and enemy tanks. They performed these rescues knowing that their efforts were often futile, that the Panther they rescued today would likely be abandoned tomorrow. Mechanics worked to exhaustion trying to maintain machines that were fundamentally unmaintainable under field conditions. They performed miracles of improvisation, cannibalizing parts from wrecked vehicles, fabricating components from scrap metal, somehow keeping a fraction of their unit's Panthers operational through sheer determination and skill. All of this effort, all of this sacrifice, in service of a weapon system that never delivered on its promise. By late 1944, as Allied armies closed in on Germany from east and west, the Panthers' shortcomings had become impossible to ignore even among the most optimistic German commanders. Field commanders increasingly requested the older Panzer IV medium tank or the Stu G3 assault gun, both of which were mechanically simpler and more reliable. The Panzer IV, which the Panther was supposed to replace, was often preferred by experienced commanders who valued reliability over raw performance. The Stu G3, essentially a Panzer III chassis with a fixed superstructure mounting a 75mm gun, was beloved by assault gun crews for its dependability. Neither of these older vehicles matched the Panther's armor or firepower, but both could be counted on to start, to move when needed, and to bring their crews home. But Hitler and the High Command remained wedded to the myth of technical superiority, unable or unwilling to acknowledge that their wonder weapon had failed. Production continued. Resources that might have been devoted to defensive fortifications, to anti-tank guns, to the thousands of unglamorous but necessary items an army requires, instead went into building more Panthers, more beautiful, powerful, sophisticated Panthers that would break down and be abandoned by the roadside. The German leadership seemed to believe that if they could just build enough Panthers, if they could just get the design right, everything would be transformed. This was magical thinking, a refusal to accept reality that characterized German strategic decision-making in the war's final years. American mechanics continued their examination of captured Panthers throughout the Northwest Europe campaign, and each new example confirmed what they already knew. In December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, American forces captured numerous Panthers abandoned during the German retreat. One particular incident became legendary among Allied intelligence officers and would be discussed in military technical journals for decades after the war. Near the village of Celle in Belgium, at the western tip of the German penetration, American forces found a Panther that had traveled less than 150 kilometers from its starting point before the final drive catastrophically failed. The tank was otherwise in perfect condition. Full ammunition load, 41 rounds for the main gun, and more than 4,000 rounds for the machine guns. Topped-off fuel tanks. Personal effects still in the crew compartment. The engine ran smoothly when tested, but it could not move. The final drive had sheared completely, rendering the entire vehicle immobile. Mechanics from the U.S. Army's Ordnance Department carefully transported this Panther to a rear area facility where it could be subjected to exhaustive technical examination. They photographed every detail. They measured every dimension. They carefully disassembled the failed final drive housing, cataloging each component and documenting the failure mode. What they found shocked even experienced engineers who had examined dozens of German vehicles and thought they understood German engineering practices. The gears showed extreme wear patterns consistent with inadequate lubrication and excessive loading. But more concerning were the metallurgical properties of the steel itself. Samples were sent to laboratories for detailed analysis using spectroscopy and other advanced techniques. The results confirmed the worst suspicions. The steel used in the gears was substandard, with internal stresses and inclusions that guaranteed premature failure. The alloy composition showed clear evidence of material substitution, with critical elements missing or present in insufficient quantities. The heat treatment, while competent, could not compensate for the inferior base material. Most damning of all, calculation of the gear ratios and load factors, combined with knowledge of the Panther's weight and the Maybach engine's torque output, confirmed what many had suspected. The final drive was fundamentally undersized for the weight of the tank and the power being transmitted through it. It was not a matter of poor maintenance or battlefield damage. It was not bad luck or operator error. The component was designed to fail, perhaps not immediately, but inevitably. The only question was whether it would last 100 kilometers or 200 before succumbing to stresses that exceeded its design limits. The technical report filed by the Ordnance Department made for sobering reading. It estimated that even under ideal conditions, with perfect maintenance and operation by skilled crews, the Panther's final drive could not be expected to last more than 1,000 kilometers before requiring replacement. In actual combat conditions, this figure dropped to as low as 150 kilometers. For comparison, a Sherman's drivetrain components routinely lasted 10,000 kilometers or more. This single component failure, this one weak link in the Panther's complex mechanical chain, effectively negated all of its advantages. A tank that must halt for major repairs after every significant movement cannot fulfill its tactical role. It becomes a liability rather than an asset, consuming resources and attention without contributing to combat effectiveness. The report circulated widely among Allied military planners and contributed to a fundamental shift in how American designers approach tank development. The lessons learned from studying the Panther's failures influenced post-war American tank design, emphasizing reliability and maintainability alongside firepower and protection. The M26 Pershing, rushed into service in the final months of the European War, incorporated these lessons. The M46, M47, and M48 that followed in the post-war years all prioritized mechanical reliability based partly on observations of what happened when it was neglected. Soviet designers, who captured even more Panthers than the Western Allies, drew similar conclusions. Post-war Soviet tanks like the T-54 emphasized rugged simplicity and ease of maintenance. Lessons learned in part from examining the Panther's sophisticated but fragile systems. The final accounting of the Panther tank's service record is brutal. The vast majority of Panthers lost during the war were not destroyed in combat. They were abandoned due to mechanical failure, lack of fuel, or lack of spare parts that could not be supplied. Their crews set demolition charges and walked away from machines that represented thousands of hours of skilled labor, irreplaceable materials, and Germany's dwindling technological edge. Each abandoned Panther became an intelligence bonanza for the Allies, revealing design details and material shortcomings that confirmed everything they had learned from captured examples. The Panther, meant to be Germany's salvation, became instead a symbol of everything wrong with German strategic thinking in the latter half of the war. Of the approximately 6,000 Panthers produced, detailed records suggest that fewer than 1,000 were actually destroyed in combat by enemy fire. The remainder were abandoned, scuttled, or lost to mechanical causes. This represents an unprecedented failure rate for a major weapon system. By comparison, of the 50,000 Shermans produced, the vast majority that were lost fell to enemy action rather than mechanical failure. This single statistic encapsulates the fundamental difference between the German and Allied approaches to armored warfare. The Germans built a technically superior tank that could not be kept operational. The Allies built an adequate tank that was always available when needed. The lessons of the Panther tank resonate far beyond World War II. In every subsequent conflict, military planners have faced the same fundamental question that confronted German engineers in 1941. When faced with an enemy advantage, do you respond with sophistication or simplicity? Do you pursue the perfect weapon or the reliable one? Do you optimize for ideal conditions or real-world chaos? The answer should be obvious, validated by decades of military experience. War is entropy. War is confusion, desperation, and Murphy's Law operating at maximum intensity. War is the environment where everything that can go wrong will go wrong at the worst possible moment. The weapon that survives war is not the most advanced but the most robust. Not the most powerful but the most dependable. Not the one with the best specifications on paper, but the one that works when you need it most. Modern military history is littered with expensive, sophisticated weapon systems that failed in the field because designers prioritized performance over reliability. Aircraft that could not maintain sortie rates because of maintenance demands, like the F-111 in its early years, or the B-1B bomber with its complex systems. Ships that spent more time in dock than at sea, requiring extensive maintenance periods that reduced their operational availability. Vehicles that required climate-controlled maintenance facilities in theaters where such facilities did not exist. Each represents the same mistake the Panther embodied, the same seduction of technical excellence without regard for operational sustainability. The lesson is relearned each generation, it seems, because the allure of perfect performance is so compelling that it blinds planners to practical realities. The Sherman tank, often criticized for its simplicity, nonetheless won its war. It carried Allied armies across every front and climate, remaining in service for decades, a testament to its reliable, practical design. The German Panther, by contrast, symbolized the fatal flaw of over-engineering, technically brilliant but fatally unreliable. When American mechanics examined a captured Panther in Belgium, their report concluded simply, "Final drive failure is systemic and inevitable. Enemy is defeating himself." That dry verdict captured the essence of Germany's wartime failure, an obsession with perfection over practicality. The Panther's final drive, failing after barely 150 kilometers, mirrored the unsustainable ambitions of the German war effort itself. Germany built the tank it wanted, not the one it needed. The Allies built machines that worked. In the end, reliable good enough triumphed over fragile perfection. By 1945, the last Panthers burned in the ruins of Berlin, undone by breakdowns, fuel shortages, and futility. Today, the Panther is remembered for its looks and power, but those who fought in them recall the fear of mechanical failure and the bitter sight of Shermans rolling past. The Panther's legacy endures as a warning. The best weapon is the one that works when you need it. Perfection means nothing without reliability, and in war, good enough wins.